They gave her the dead Vineyard as an insult, a frozen ruin to break her, a slow failure to be rid of her by. They had no idea they had just handed the one person alive who could bring it back to life. She was 19 years old, and the whole of her inheritance was a slope of frost-killed vines that 3 parishes had already agreed was a grave. Her name was Marion Ashby. The man who handed it to her was her mother's brother, Aldous, the 4th Duke of Ravensmore, and he did it without once meeting her eyes. He set the deed to the ruined estate of Lark Hollow upon the desk, between them the way a man sets down a debt he is glad to be rid of, and he told her plainly that better women than she had broken themselves on far less. It was the meanest of all his holdings, a steep, forgotten fold of ground in the warm south of Sarnshire where the vines had died in a single terrible night, 4 winters gone and no soul had troubled with them since. He gave it to her to watch her fail. He gave it to her so that he need never look upon her face again. But the Duke had made one mistake, the only one that would ever matter, for behind Lark Hollow's crumbling walls, sealed away in the cold and the dark where 4 years of neglect had never thought to look, lay a secret worth more than every green acre of his dukedom, and Marion Ashby was the one person alive who could find it. Settle in with us tonight, and let us travel back together to the autumn of 1861, to a sheltered valley in the south of Sarnshire, to a story of quiet defiance, of a proud man proven wrong, and of one extraordinary discovery hidden in a place everyone else had given up for dead. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening from this evening. We always love to know who has drawn a chair up to the fire with us. She had not always been the poor relation. She had been born in a low white house at the edge of a hard northern parish, the only child of a marriage both families had called a mistake. Her father, John Ashby, was the son of vine growers, an unlikely trade in that raw country, and a stubborn one. Her mother had been the Duke's youngest sister, a gentlewoman who had scandalized her people by loving a man with soil under his nails and choosing him anyway. When the fever took them both in the same wet spring, Marion was 8 years old. She was given not to the Duke, who did not want her, but to her father's mother, who did. Her grandmother was named Seraphine. She had come to England as a girl, one of the many French families washed north by the long years of upheaval across the water, and she had carried with her the only wealth her family had left, the knowledge of how to make a vine live in a place that did not want it to. She had grown grapes on a bitter slope where the almanac swore nothing would ripen, and she had made a small, honest wine that the neighbors drank at weddings and pretended not to be surprised by. It was Seraphine who raised Marion, and Seraphine who taught her. The teaching did not look like schooling. It looked like a small girl following an old woman up a frozen hillside at dawn, learning which buds to spare and which to cut, learning to read the set of a frost in the smell of the air before it fell, learning that a vine will forgive almost anything but impatience. Her grandmother put a knife into her hand before she was 10, a serpette, a short curved pruning blade with a worn horn handle, the steel folded and refolded by some long-dead French smith, and taught her to make the single clean cut that a vine wants, angled away from the bud, never sawing, never tearing. A vine is a memory, the old woman would say in her careful, accented English. It remembers every wound you give it, so give it good ones. By the time Seraphine died, Marion could prune a row blindfold by the feel of the wood. She could graft one variety onto the rootstock of another and coax the join to take. She could taste a green grape in August and tell you, near enough, what the wine would be. It was a strange accomplishment for a young woman, and an unwelcome one. The sort of thing that made the Duke's housekeeper purse her lips. The sort of thing no one at Ravensmore Court knew what to do with. When Marion came south at 18, alone in the world at last, with her grandmother buried and the little northern holding sold to pay the debts, she brought 2 things of value into that great house. One was the serpette, wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of her box. The other was everything the knife had taught her, which no one thought to ask about at all. She lived at Ravensmore Court for a little under a year, and in all that time the Duke spoke to her, perhaps a dozen times. He was not a cruel man in the way of the stories. He did not rage, he did not strike, he did not starve her. His power was of a colder kind. He simply could not be brought to see her. She was a flaw in the smooth surface of his consequence, a reminder of a sister who had married down and died poor, and he handled the difficulty of her the way he handled all difficulties, which was to arrange for it to be somewhere else. The arrangement was concluded on a gray morning in the last week of October, in the Duke's study, with his man of business, Mr. Prentice, reading the settlement aloud in a dry and level voice while the Duke stood at the window with his back to the room, watching his own rooks cross his own sky. The document was brief. It conveyed to Marian Ashby, spinster, the freehold of the estate known as Lark Hollow, together with the cottage and outbuildings thereon and the slope of ground formerly under vine, the whole comprising some 11 acres in the parish of Nettlecombe Prior. There was no annuity. There was no provision for repair. There was a single clause, dry as the paper it was written on, releasing his grace from all further obligation to the said Marian Ashby from the date of her taking possession. Mr. Prentice finished, and set the paper down, and looked at her the way men look at someone they expect to weep. She did not weep. She sat very straight in the hard chair, her gloved hands folded in her lap, and she read the clause again herself, slowly, to be certain she had understood it. Then she asked, in a voice that was perfectly even, whether the vines at Lark Hollow had been grubbed up after the frost, or left standing. It was not the question anyone had expected. Mr. Prentice blinked and consulted his notes and admitted that he did not know. The estate had been let go entirely. He believed nothing had been done to it at all. Then they are still in the ground, Marian said, mostly to herself, and something in the flat calm of it made the solicitor uneasy without his knowing why. The Duke turned from the window at last. He looked at his niece with the mild, faraway distaste of a man examining a stain he has decided not to trouble the servants over. "It is a courtesy," he said, "more than your mother's marriage entitled you to expect. The place is worth nothing, but it is yours, and it is far from here. I trust you will find that suits us both." He paused. "I would not raise your hopes of it. Better women than you have broken themselves on less." She rose and she thanked him, not warmly, but correctly, with the same composure she had worn through the whole of it, and she saw the small flicker of irritation cross his face, the irritation of a man who has offered an insult and been denied the pleasure of watching it land. He had wanted her frightened. He had wanted her grateful, or wounded, or begging. What he had got instead was a quiet young woman asking after the condition of dead vines, and it disturbed him more than tears would have, though he could not have said why. She left Ravensmore Court the next morning before the house was properly awake, and she did not look back at it. She would not take the coach. She had almost no money, and what she had she meant to keep, and so she walked the better part of 2 days along the chalk lanes of the south, her box on a hired carter's cart, as far as the market town, and the last miles on her own 2 feet, the surpet in her pocket where she could feel the shape of it against her hip. The country changed as she went. The hard open uplands gave way to something gentler and more sheltered. Wooded combes and warm hollows where the last apples still hung, valleys that held the autumn light like water held in a cupped hand. She read the land as her grandmother had taught her, the lie of the slopes, the way the frost would drain or gather, the soil breaking pale and stony under a scuffed heel. Twice she stopped without meaning to, simply to look at a south-facing hillside and think, without hope and almost against her will, a vine would be happy there. It was near dusk on the second day when she came at last to the mouth of a narrow lane, overhung and unmended, and a leaning wooden board on which the paint had almost gone. She could just make out the letters, Lark Hollow. She went up the lane in the failing light, and the valley opened before her, and she stopped. The house was a low huddle of stone with half its roof fallen in, black against the last of the sky. Below it and around it, climbing the whole of the great south slope, in long ruined ranks, stood the vines, or what had been the vines. 4 winters of neglect had left them a wilderness of black, twisted wire. Their trellises collapsed, bramble and dead bindweed knotted through them, every row silvered now with the first hard frost of the coming winter, so that the whole hillside seemed to glitter faintly, coldly, like a field of broken glass. Nothing moved. No bird sang. The cold came up off the ground with the smell of rot and old iron, and the light went out of the west as she stood there, and the ruin gave back nothing at all. She stood at the gate a long while, her breath clouding, the surpet warm from her body against her hand. Everyone had said this place was dead. The Duke had said it. The whole county said it. And looking at it now, in the last gray light of that October evening, with the frost hardening on the black and broken rose, it would have been the easiest thing in the world to believe them. But Marian Ashby had been taught by a woman who was seldom wrong, that there is a difference between a thing that is dead and a thing that is only waiting, and that the difference is not always visible from the gate. The frost held through the night and into the morning, and Marian woke stiff and cold in the one corner of the cottage where the roof had held, with the gray light coming thin through a broken shutter and her breath standing white above her in the room. She had not slept much. She had come in at full dark the evening before, too tired to do more than find a dry corner, spread her cloak, and lie down with her box for a pillow and the surpet unwrapped and near her hand, less for protection than for company. But with the light she rose and shook the cold out of her limbs and began, slowly, methodically, the way her grandmother had taught her to begin any large task, to take the true measure of what she had been given. The cottage was worse by day than it had seemed by dusk, and better. Worse, because the daylight showed her every failing of it, the fallen ridge, the black stain of water down the north wall, the bird's nest swatted in the chimney, the floor of the main room open to the sky and grown up with nettle and dock through the cracked flags. But better, too, because underneath the ruin the bones of the place were good, and she had been raised to see bones. The walls were dressed stone, thick and square and true, mortared by someone who had known his trade. The window openings were deep and well cut. When she went from room to room, rapping the walls with her knuckles and pressing her palm flat to the plaster, she found that 3 of the 4 downstairs rooms were sound in their masonry. Whatever had happened to their roofs, and that the smallest of them, a low, north-facing room off the kitchen with a stone-flagged floor and a single small window and a wide-arched fireplace far too large for so mean a space, was very nearly whole. Its roof held. Its door hung true on its hinges. Someone, once, had cared a great deal about this small dark room, and she could not at first think why. She chose it for her camp. It was the driest place in the house and the easiest to warm, and by the middle of that first morning she had swept it clean with a besom of birch twigs she bound herself, cleared 4 winters of jackdaw litter from the chimney with a long falling branch, and laid and lit her first fire from dead hedgewood and a twist of dry bracken. The chimney drew beautifully. That surprised her. A chimney that has stood cold and open for years will smoke and sulk before it draws. And she sat back on her heels and watched the flames stand up straight and pale in the great arched hearth, and felt the first thin warmth reach her face, and understood, dimly, that this was not the fireplace of a scullery. It was too grand, too carefully built, too deep. But she was cold and she was tired, and she set the thought aside. The vineyard she left until the afternoon because she was almost afraid of it. When at last she went out to the slope, the frost had burned off the higher rows and lay still blue in the hollows, and she walked up between the ruined ranks, with the surpet in her hand and her heart going harder than she wished it would. It was as bad as it had looked. Worse, the trellising had rotted and fallen and dragged the vines down with it into black tangled heaps. Bramble and old man's beard had swarmed over everything, and where she could get to the wood at all, it was gray and split and dead to the touch. 4 years abandoned on top of the one great killing. Frost that had finished the last living harvest. She cut into a cane at random with the knife, a clean-angled cut just as Seraphine had taught her, and looked at the wound. Brown. Dry. Dead clean through. She tried another, and another, moving down the row, and each was the same, and something in her chest began to close. And then, near the bottom of the slope, the warmest ground, the last to freeze and the first to thaw, the deep sheltered foot of the south face where the sun would gather longest, she cut into a thick old cane on one of the ancient, low, gnarled vines that grew there, quite different in there, save from the neat young rose above, and the wood beneath her blade was green. Not much. A thread of it. A bare living rim of green under the gray bark, the faintest breath of moisture in the cut. But it was there. She stood very still, holding the cane, not daring yet to believe it. And then she moved to the next old vine and cut again, and found the same, and to the next, and the same. The young modern vines that climbed the upper slope, the pride and profit of the last owner, were dead, killed outright by the frost that had broken the estate. But down here at the warm foot of the hill, the old vines, the strange, low, twisted, ancient ones that no one had bothered to grub because no one thought them worth the labor, were not dead. They were sleeping. She said nothing aloud. There was no one to say it to. But she went back up the slope to her fire that evening with the knowledge folded quiet and enormous inside her, and she understood that she had a very great deal of work before her, and that she was not, after all, going to leave. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. She rose with the light and worked while it lasted and slept by her fire when it failed. She ate sparingly and spent nothing she did not have to. And on the fourth day, because a woman cannot live on hedge nuts and the ends of her own provisions forever, she walked the 2 miles down into the village of Nettlecombe Prior to see what might be bought and what might be learned. It was a small place, grey stone and thatch, a church and a green and a huddle of cottages along a stream, and it received her much as such places receive any stranger, which is to say with a great and silent curiosity worn behind a mask of not looking. She found the baker's, because a baker's is where a village keeps its warmth and its talk, and she bought a small loaf with one of her few coins, and the baker's wife, a broad, red-armed, sharp-eyed woman named Hester Combe, looked at her over the counter and asked, not unkindly, but very directly, where she was biding. At Larkhollow, Marion said. The whole shop went quiet. Hester Combe set down the loaf she had been wrapping and looked at Marion with a new and complicated expression, half pity and half a kind of superstitious wariness, as though the girl had named a graveyard for her address. That place is dead, my dear, she said gently, the way you tell a child a hard truth. The frost of '57 took it, killed the vines in a night, and near killed old Mr. Wenlock along with them, the shame of it. There's nothing up there now but stone and ghosts. You'd do better not to bide there at all. Marion thanked her for the bread, and did not argue, because she had learned long ago that there is no profit in arguing with what a village has decided to believe. But she carried away one word out of all of it, turning it over as she climbed back up the lane in the cold blue dusk. Wenlock, a name. Someone had made this place. Someone had built a great deep fireplace into a mean little room and planted strange old frost-hardy vines at the warm foot of a south slope, and been broken by a frost and shamed out of the county. And no one had spoken his name in 4 years until she asked. It was that night, sitting late by her fire in the small warm room, that she noticed the wall. She had been staring at the fire, half asleep, letting the flames make their shapes, when her eye drifted to the back of the great arched hearth, and something in it was wrong. She had cleaned that fireplace herself, cleared it of nests, and swept its stone, and she had thought she knew it. But the firelight fell aslant across the rear wall of the recess now, low and raking, and by that light she could see what the flat daylight had hidden, that the stonework at the back of the hearth was not all of a piece. Most of it was the same old dressed stone as the rest of the house, dark with a century of soot, but one section, low and to the left, a patch perhaps 3 feet square, was built of different stone to smaller blocks, more roughly laid, the mortar between them paler and newer than anywhere else in that ancient room. It had been soot-stained too, deliberately, she thought, to match. But the raking firelight found the difference the flat light could not, and once she had seen it, she could not unsee it. She knelt and put her hand flat against that patch of wall, and it was cold, colder than the stone around it, though it sat at the very back of a lit hearth, a steady, deep, seeping cold, as though behind those newer stones lay not the warm heart of the house, but something else entirely, some hollow, some space, some room the fire could not reach. And when she leaned close and laid her ear against the cold stone, over the soft crackle of her own fire she heard it, very faint, very slow, a sound she could not at first make sense of. Not tapping, not water, a slow, patient, rhythmic settling, drip and pause and drip, coming from somewhere down and behind and within, the sound of a cold place breathing in the dark. Marion drew back from the wall and sat a long time on the cold flags with the fire dying beside her, looking at that patch of paler stone, and knew that she was not going to sleep, and knew that by morning she was going to have to open it. She did not wait for full morning. She waited only for enough gray light to work by, and then she banked the fire aside, and knelt at the back of the cold hearth, and set to. She had no proper tools, only the things a ruin gives up to a searching hand, a broken iron fire dog for a lever, a heavy flat stone for a maul, and the serpette, which she used not on the wall but to scrape and worry at the pale mortar, because it was the only fine edge she had, and her grandmother had taught her that patience does what force cannot. She worked at the joints first, scratching the newer mortar out, crumb by crumb, blowing the dust away, digging deeper. It was slow. It was cold. Her fingers went numb, and she warmed them at the banked coals and went back to it. An hour passed and another. The mortar here was younger than the house by a lifetime, and softer for it, and at last she had one small block loose enough to rock. She worked a fire dog into the gap behind it, and leaned her whole weight on the lever, and with a low grinding complaint, the stone came free, and she caught it in her lap. Cold air breathed out of the hole, cold and still and faintly sweet, the smell of deep earth and old oak, and something else beneath, a dark fruited richness, a smell she knew in her blood, though she had never smelled it so strong. It was the smell of wine sleeping in the dark. She pulled the stones out one by one after that, faster now, her heart going hard, until the opening was wide enough to pass a lantern, and then wide enough to pass herself. Beyond it a few worn steps went down into blackness. She lit her stub of candle with a shaking hand, and went down into the cold, one hand on the wall, the little flame streaming sideways in the draught of that buried air. It was a cellar, a true wine cellar, small and vaulted and perfectly dry, cut back into the hill behind the house, so that the earth itself kept it cold, that steady seeping cold she had felt through the hearthstone, the slow drip of groundwater from the vault's crown that she had heard breathing in the dark. Someone had built it with great care and then sealed it from within the house so completely that 4 years of neglect and a village of ghost stories had passed over it and never guessed. And along the far wall, in a wooden rack furred gray with the soft, clean dust of undisturbed years, lay bottles. Not many, perhaps 3 dozen, no more. But she took one down and wiped the dust from its shoulder with her thumb and held it to the candle and saw the wine within glow, a deep and living garnet, clear as a jewel, sound and whole and beautiful after all its years in the dark. Each bottle was sealed with wax and marked in a small neat hand on a yellowed paper label. And she read the nearest by the candle's light, Lark Hollow, the great vintage, 1849. And her hands were not quite steady as she set it back. But it was not the wine that undid her. It was what lay beside the rack, on a small oak table pushed against the vault wall, wrapped in oilcloth exactly as she herself wrapped things she loved. A thick book, a journal, its pages close written, and its cover soft with handling. And weighted upon it, holding it down against the years, a single sealed letter, the ink of its directions still legible in the candlelight. To whomever is brave enough or desperate enough to find this. Marian sat down slowly on the cold steps and opened it and read. It was from a man named Thomas Wenlock, and it was written in the winter of 1857, in the weeks after the great frost, by a man who knew he was finished. He had made the vineyard at Lark Hollow, he wrote, had made it out of nothing, out of a bare south slope and a conviction the whole county thought madness, that fine wine could be grown in the cold English south by a man patient enough and skilled enough to court the frost instead of fearing it. For 30 years he had proved them wrong. His wines had been quietly famous among those few who knew. And then in the spring of 57 he had done the thing his own long experience should have forbidden him. He had let ambition hurry him, had planted the upper slope thick with a tender, fashionable vine that promised a greater yield, had grown impatient with the slow, safe old ways. And the late killing frost of that year had taken the whole tender planting in a single night, and with it, his name, his fortune, and his welcome in the county. He was an old man ruined by his own impatience, and he knew it. And he wrote it down without flinching so that whoever came after might be spared it. I write this, he wrote, because I cannot bear that it should all be lost. The fools believe the vineyard dead. Let them. A vineyard is not the young wood the frost can take in a night. A vineyard is the old root that remembers. I beg you, you who have found this, whoever you are, cast out as I was cast out, or you would not have troubled to break my wall. Do not squander what I have left you. This wine is not for selling in your want. It is a seed, not a supper. It is proof kept back against the day someone worthy could show the world what this ground can do. Marian read the letter through 3 times, there on the cold cellar steps, with the candle guttering, and when she had done, she was no longer alone. That was the thing of it, the thing she had not known, she needed until it was given to her. She had come to Lark Hollow the last living soul of a family that no one wanted, the poor relation, the flaw in the smooth surface, and she had thought herself the only person in the world who had ever looked at a dead-seeming vine and known to cut for the green. And here, a lifetime before her, was another, a stranger, an old man dead these several years, who had loved this same slope and been broken by the same cold county, and had reached forward across all those years to set his hand, quite deliberately, in hers. She took up the journal then, and that was the second thing, the greater thing, the door behind the door. For the journal was no keepsake. It was a working record, 30 years of it, the whole craft of the place set down in Thomas Wenlock's close-neat hand, season by season, and row by row. And in it, page after page, was the answer to a question Marian had not yet dared to ask. The old low vines at the warm foot of the slope, the strange gnarled ancient ones she had cut into and found green. Wenlock had planted them first of all, 30 years before, and they were not the tender modern stock at all. They were a hardy old northern vine brought south from a hard climate, chosen and grafted and coaxed over decades precisely because it could take a frost that would kill anything finer and live. The old root remembers, he had written. And here in the journal was the proof of it. The varieties named, the grafts recorded, the exact management of them set down. How to prune them hard and late. How to lay straw against the deepest cold. How to draw from their small fierce grapes the great, garnate wine that lay now, sleeping in the rack behind her. They were not dead, they had never been dead. They were dormant and old and starved of care, and they were sitting on the warmest, best strained, most sheltered ground on the whole estate. And everything needed to bring them back to bear was written in this book, in a hand that might have been her grandmother's for all the kinship she felt, with it waiting for someone who could read it and had the skill to use it. Someone patient, someone who had been taught by a woman of the same hard old emigre wisdom, taught to court the frost and never hurry the wood, taught with a serpette put into her hand before she was 10 years old. Marian knelt in the cold vault a long time. The wine glowed garnet in the rack. The old man's letter lay open on her knee. Above her, up through the broken house and out across the frost, 11 ruined acres slept under the coming winter. And at the warm foot of the great south slope the old vines waited in the ground, holding their green rim of life close against the cold, remembering. The wine was a beginning then, not an escape, not a supper to be sold against her want, but a seed kept back for the worthy, and a plan, and a purpose, and the hand of a dead man in hers. She closed the journal, and wrapped it again in its oilcloth against her breast, and took up her candle, and climbed back into the light of her own small fire, with the whole shape of the years to come, turning quiet and certain in her mind. She was not going to sell the wine and run. She was going to wake the vineyard. Spring came late and cautious to Nettlecombe Prior that year, and found Marian Ashby already at work on the slope, kneeling in the thawing ground with her grandmother's serpette in her hand, and Thomas Wenlock's journal open on a flat stone beside her, held down against the wind by a lump of the estate's own flint. She had spent the winter preparing. She had read the journal until she nearly knew it, matched its rows to the ground, learned the shape of the old man's mind. She had sold at last and very carefully exactly 4 bottles of the great vintage, no more, carrying them by cart to a wine merchant in the county town who did not at first believe what he was tasting, and then could not stop tasting it, and who paid her a sum that made her hands go cold, and asked where in God's name it came from, and was told only that there was very little of it and none more to be had that year. That money she did not spend on herself. She spent it on the vineyard, exactly as the old man had bidden her, and the spending of it became the slow chain of small victories that carried her through the year. The roof came first, because a woman cannot work who cannot keep dry, and because a mended house tells a village something, a ruined one cannot. She hired a thatcher from 3 parishes off who did not know Lark Hollow's reputation, and by May the cottage stood whole again, under new gold straw, and the smoke of a proper hearth rose from it morning and evening for the first time in 4 years. Then the fallen trellising oak posts split and set by a wheelwright named Amos Tarr, a lean, silent, skeptical man, who came the first day certain he was being paid to prop up a corpse, and came the second day because he had seen her cut into the old vines and seen the green, and could not, being a craftsman, stop wondering. Then the clearing of the brambles, acre by acre, her own hands and Tara's boy, and in time 2 more from the village. The black dead upper rows grubbed out and burned in great sweet-smelling fires, and the old low vines at the warm foot of the slope, freed at last from 4 years of strangling growth, and pruned back hard and clean and late, exactly as the journal said. Each cut angled away from the bud, never sawing, never tearing, the way Seraphine's knife had always known. The village watched. It could not help itself. Hester Coombe came up the lane one afternoon on the pretext of a delivery and stayed an hour and went away thoughtful. Men who had told their wives the girl was mad found reasons to walk the top of the lane and look down at the slope where the ground was coming clean and ordered and green. And in June, when the freed old vines broke bud all down the warm foot of the hill, burst into leaf strong and certain, 30 years of remembering waking all at once, the thing became impossible to deny, and the county's certainty about Lark Hollow began, very quietly, to turn. It was not a quick harvest, nor an easy one. Wine is never quick, but she had the old man's whole craft under her hand and her grandmother's in her blood, and the frost-hardy vines gave her, that first autumn, a small, fierce, beautiful crop of grapes that she picked and pressed and set to ferment in the cold cellar behind the hearth, working the journal's method against the modern season, courting the cold as she had been taught, never hurrying the wood. And through the next winter and into the year beyond she watched the new wine come up dark and clean and true, not yet the equal of the sleeping garnet vintage in the rack, for that had 30 years of the old man's mastery and its own long dark patience in it, but the same in kind, unmistakably, the same, Lark Hollow come again out of ground the whole county had buried. Word of a thing that good does not stay in a valley. The merchant in the county town, who had never forgotten those 4 bottles, carried a bottle of the new wine himself to a supplier who supplied a household that supplied, in the slow ascending way of such things, the royal cellars. And in the autumn of 1864, a quiet order came down to Nettlecombe Prior by a clerk in a good coat who had to ask 3 times for the road, for a case of the Lark Hollow wine, to be laid down at the pleasure of the court. Marian read the letter standing in her own doorway under the gold thatch with the serpent in her apron pocket and the old vines heavy with the second harvest below her, and she did not weep at that either. She only went down, in the long amber light of that September evening, and stood among the living rows a while, and let it be true. Of the Duke, she heard only at second hand, which was, she found, exactly enough. She heard that his grace had been at a great dinner in the spring where the wine was poured and much admired, and had asked its name and had been told, Lark Hollow, in Sarnshire, your own county, the little estate that came so wonderfully back from the dead, and had said nothing at all and changed the subject. She heard that a man who had been at Ravensmoor described the Duke's face in that moment as a study. She never saw him again and never wished to. He had wanted to give her a ruin and be quit of her, to arrange the difficulty of her existence somewhere far off, where he need not watch it fail. And the failing had simply, quietly, in its own time, refused to come. He was not confounded by any word of hers. He was confounded by her irrelevance to his confounding, by a hillside going green and a wine reaching a table he had never in his life managed to impress, entirely without his leave and entirely beyond his reach. That was the whole of her vindication, and she found she wanted no more of it than that. Hester Coombe's husband tipped his cap to her now on the green. Amos Tarr, who 3 years before had come certain he was tending a corpse, spoke of our vineyard without seeming to notice he had said it. Where once a whole village had told a stranger not to bide at Lark Hollow because the place was dead, now children were sent up the lane on errands proud to have been chosen, and the old men on the church wall argued with authority about frost and rootstock as though they had believed in the vines all along. On an evening late in that second autumn, with the harvest in and the new wine sleeping in the cold behind the hearth, and the whole valley gone to gold and long blue shadow, Marian sat on the stone step of her mended house and set two things on the worn oak beside her. One was the sarpet, her grandmother's short curved knife with its worn horn handle, the steel folded 100 years ago by a dead French smith, the blade that had put the green under her hand on the worst morning of her life and made every clean cut of the vineyard since. The other was Thomas Wenlock's journal, its cover soft with two men's handling now, hers and his, the working record of a stranger who had reached across the years to set his skill in the hand of whoever proved worthy, and had not reached in vain. She laid them side by side in the last of the light, the woman's knife and the dead man's book, the two hands that had made her, and beside them, catching the low sun red as a jewel, one bottle of the first new vintage, sealed and labeled in her own neat hand, Lark Hollow. She thought of the Duke then, once, briefly, without heat, the man at the window with his back to the room, watching his own rooks cross his own sky, so certain of what a thing was worth. And then she let the thought go, the way you let go a king you have cut and found dead, and turned back to the ones that were living. He had thought he was handing her a ruin, a dead place, a slow and certain failure to be rid of her by. He had been wrong about every part of it. He had been wrong about every part of it. He had not given her a frozen vineyard at all. He had given her the old root that remembered, and every green thing it was still waiting, all that time, to become. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end of Marian's story tonight. It means more than you know that you drew your chair up to this fire and stayed until the last of the light. If this tale kept you warm, do give it a like and subscribe, so the next one finds its way to you. And tell us in the comments what forgotten corner of your own life, a garden gone to seed, a skill set down, a dream left dormant, is quietly waiting for you to go back and tend it. We should love to hear.